So, this week we're going to be talking about native plant species and weeds. So, these PowerPoint slides come from the King County Noxious Weed Control Program, and I'll be posting a link to these in your assignment for the week. So, there's two kind of categories of plants that we want to talk about. One of them is called a native plant, which is a plant that either grew, lived, or evolved in a particular place over time, or a plant that was growing here before humans introduced other plants from distant places. So, an example of a native plant would be salal. This is a plant that produces berries in the late summer, and it's one that has a lot of significance in indigenous cultures up and down the coast from California all the way up to Canada. So, this is a really good plant that we want to have around because it's been here, it's a part of our ecosystem, and it's beneficial. So, what makes native plants so great? This is another one called camas lily. They use less water and they save energy. They're meant to live in this environment, so they're used to how much water they get from natural rainfall, and so they don't need additional watering like a lawn. They need less gardening time to maintain. They're resistant to disease and they don't need pesticides to survive. They reduce flooding and clean our water and air. So, native plants, all plants clean our air, but native plants in particular, because they're used to the water production from our atmosphere, the rain, and the soil conditions here, they're able to hold the soil in place so we don't have things like landslides. So they keep our soils held down. And a lot of them have natural filtration to clean the waters that's running through them. We kind of talked a tiny bit about groundwater in last week's assignment. So these are going to help clean the groundwater. It's all the water that falls on the ground, seeps into the soil, and then runs off into the ocean. They provide proper shelter and food for wildlife. So I really want you guys thinking about all the things that you learned in your ecosystems unit earlier this year. Thinking about how if you take plants that are part of the ecosystem and serve a function, they're interacting with all sorts of things in that ecosystem in different ways. So maybe it provides food for one animal, but it provides shelter for another animal. And so if you take out or change this plant, you're going to be affecting all sorts of parts of your ecosystem because they're all kind of interlocked and connected. And this is huge. They do belong to our Northwest ecosystem, and they help keep our natural balance of life going. So before colonizers came, we had a lot of natural spaces and things were well maintained and balanced. And so we want to try to do as much as we can here, even with the industrialization and development around our natural areas. So what is a weed? Well, a weed can be something delicious like blackberries. So the blackberries, most of the blackberries that you would see around here are Himalayan blackberries. So they're invasive. They come from the Himalayas. There is a native species of blackberry that grows here, but it is not as competitive as these Himalayan blackberries, and so they've sort of taken over a lot of areas. A weed is something that is growing where it wants to and not where it was planted, so it can spread around. It takes water, food, or habitat from desired plants. So if you have seen any of these big blackberry bushes, you'll see that they're everywhere and they take up a ton of space from native species. Weeds can sometimes be useful in one place and harmful in another. They're useful in the place where they came from, so like Himalayan blackberry, or if you're able to contain them to a small area and you want to use them to have blackberries to eat. But once they take over natural spaces, they're harmful. An invasive weed is one that was introduced here from somewhere else in the world. It has seed heads with thousands of seeds in each pod. Seeds that germinate within a wide range of temperature and moisture conditions. So this makes sense because that's why it was able to come from somewhere else in the world and do well here, is because it's able to survive and produce more flowers in a range of climates. So an example of that is Scotch broom. That's this yellow flower. You will see this it grows really fast. It takes entire fields up, and it causes really bad allergies for people. So Scotch broom is a major cause of allergies here. Some of these plants also grow so rapidly, and they spread so rapidly, like this Scotch broom, that they use up soil nutrients before native plants can use them. And they're kind of throwing off the balance not only in the land itself, but in the soil systems underneath. And even more so because of these extensive root systems can rob native plants of precious water reserves. So another plant that we'll learn about with these really extensive root systems is something called English ivy. And once you see a picture of English ivy, you're going to recognize it because it is everywhere. And it has these really intricate weed systems that can cover whole large areas of ground, as well as climb up and choke large trees. So invasive plants come because sometimes people bring them here because they're pretty and people want them. They get carried on clothing. They get carried in like bags of feed, things like that. But they are brought by people in general. And that's why they're invasive, is because they wouldn't be able to travel outside of their normal range without the help of people in one way or another. So a noxious weed is a specific kind of weed that's invasive and harmful, and the government is trying to stop it. So one example of this is something called garlic mustard. You can see here. Somebody might have brought it because it's really pretty. It's got these cute little flowers, but you can see that it just takes over entire areas of forest where there should be other plants. Some of these can't be sold to others, some of these can't be sold, and others have to be removed to keep them from causing harm. So a lot of them have to be removed, and because a lot of these grow so rapidly, it's really hard to control them. So they can completely take over a place, just like this garlic mustard, making them plant bullies. Again, they're really hard to control because some of them grow so rapidly that you would have to be just pulling and constantly monitoring for signs of new growth of this because, there's probably roots left that are sprouting. And some are poisonous to people and animals. They could have thorns, like those Himalayan blackberries. They could have poisons. They could have nasty smells or flavors. And they're really opportunistic. So they just grow into new openings in disturbed places and destroy native plant communities. So the hard thing is maybe you take out this garlic mustard and then you have this disturbed area that, unless you specifically plant it with more native plants, you could have a different invasive or noxious weed species grow in this area. So it takes a lot of work to kind of bring back the balance to our natural ecosystem that we disrupted. So how are these damaging specifically? How are these damaging to ecosystems and wildlife? So this is an example of a purple loosestrife. It's really pretty to people, but it's useless for wildlife. They reduce animal habitat and food sources. So if this was a field where you had a lot of elk or deer that were eating what was here before, and then you had something like purple loosestrife that they can't eat, all of a sudden their food sources are gone. They attract pollinators away from native plants. So we don't have our native plants that are able to reproduce as much because you have these plants that have a ton of pollen and seeds, and so they're attracting bees and butterflies. They crowd out native plants, and they disrupt the ecosystem and decrease biodiversity. You can see that because instead of having a whole different variety of plants, actually, if you kind of look in the top half of this photo, there's a bunch of different kinds of trees. There's a lot of biodiversity here. And then when you have something like this invasive weed, it just takes over and you have entire fields of it. And you can see that in this garlic mustard infestation. You have a very little diversity in what's on the ground. And then that'll happen as well with Scotch broom. And then sometimes they can clog up streams and lakes just by taking over the water system. If you've ever seen bamboo, that's one that's definitely brought here for landscaping by people, but it grows so rapidly it can really change a stream ecosystem and be damaging for fish that might be using it. So, this is an example of how invasive plants are changing the ecosystem. We have this beautiful ecosystem with lots of biodiversity. So we have our elk that's using the sealed. We have all these different kinds of wildflowers. And then all of a sudden one knapweed plant comes in and this little fluffy bit spreads by seed. It can be spread by the wind even because it's so light. And all of a sudden, this tiny plant has become an entire meadow, and you don't have that biodiversity anymore. It takes over, and these plants are not edible to things like elk, deer, and cattle. And so essentially, you're just leaving this food source entirely bare for herbivores that were depending on the previous ecosystem to feed them. So this has happened in Washington, Montana, and Oregon. And the interesting thing about invasive species, plants in particular, is you can look at examples all around the world and all around the country of how these invasive species have come and take over and changed ecosystems. So they can be really dangerous to some animals and livestock. So this is something called tansy. And if this were to blow into a horse pasture and the horses eat it, they could get very sick. And so again, not only do you have competition with the foods that animals are eating, but you can also make them sick. And if you have something like a pasture where you're raising cattle for like beef, then the farmers that are trying to grow those cattle aren't able to feed them as much. And so it reduces their profits. It reduces how much beef that they can grow on that land. So also, in addition to being poisonous to animals, some of these invasive weeds are also poisonous to people. All right, so weed is something we don't want, and there's three kinds. Nuisance is any plant out of place, unwanted where it's growing, difficult to get rid of, with an ability to spread, something like a dandelion or a blackberry bush. Remember when a dandelion, when you go from the yellow flower to that white puffy ball, you know, if you've ever blown on it to make a wish, you're spreading those seeds everywhere. And so those are able to spread by the wind, and they spread easily to take over more areas. We also have invasive weeds, which are non-native plants that invade natural areas and grow and reproduce quickly, crowding out native plants and harming natural ecosystems, like Scotch broom or knapweed. And then we have noxious weeds, which are non-native harmful plants that the government is trying to stop from spreading in order to protect farms, natural resources, ecosystems, and people. So something like garlic mustard or tansy ragwort. I'm going to also talk about English ivy. English ivy is a huge noxious weed, one brought by people because they think it's pretty for landscaping, but it does a lot of damage to our big old trees here that we know are providing us with oxygen, holding the soil intact, and providing a number of benefits for our ecosystems. So what can we do about it? Well, you guys are going to be able to look at what kind of plants are on this King County noxious weed list, see what are some common noxious weeds that people are looking to get rid of actively, prevent problems by watching for new weeds and removing them right away. So later when we're back to normal, you could volunteer for a park if you want to. I know in the summer, St. Edward's loves if people with a guide would volunteer to take out English ivy and save their old forests. You could also be working in your own spaces. If you have a yard in your home, you can look at what kinds of noxious weeds you might have. Maybe you have an old tree in your backyard that's covered in English ivy and you want to remove it. Use best management practices to control or remove invasive plants. So you're definitely going to want an adult before you start pulling up plants, because we don't want to harm the ecosystem more by trying to help it. So we want to be really well-intentioned and well-informed before we try to help control this problem. And there's also kinds of biological controls, like beneficial insects, which will, preferentially feed on specific plants or help keep your ecosystem in check. So there's also, we only talked about land plants, but there's a lot of noxious weeds that are water plants, and we're only talking about invasive species that are plants, but there's a ton that are animals as well. But what you guys should do is learn what plants cause problems and don't plant them. You can volunteer to pull weeds in parks when it's safe. Check your clothing, bike, boat, and car for noxious weed hitchhikers. And never dump your aquarium pets or their plants in a lake or a stream. So some of the species of turtles, the common species of turtles that you might see in lakes in Washington, are not native, but they were dumped in Lake Washington by people who had a red slider turtle, and decided they didn't want it anymore and got rid of it. So always properly dispose of plants and try to rehome aquarium pets. Okay.